This is another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm your host, Janet Lee, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Barbara Oakley. Thank you very much for joining us today, Barbara.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here.
I see that you earned actually 2 bachelor degrees in disparate fields. How you went from one to the other?
Well, my first degree was in Slavic languages and literature. I learned Russian when I was in the Army at the Defense Language Institute. And then my second degree was about, 7-8 years later, and it was it was actually 10 years later, and it was in electrical engineering. So I switched from being a linguist to being an engineer, and it was really hard. And it was especially hard because I was a total math phobe. I absolutely hated math and science and never thought I could do it. And so language and culture are always important, but I could see the trends that also having some quantitative abilities and technical abilities were going to be increasingly important. And so I couldn't really get a job as a Russian translator. There's very few available. I did get one of them. I worked as a Russian translator on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and I drank a lot because that was part of the job, really. But your liver can only take so much of that. So I did end up switching when I started at age 26, went back to remedial high school math, and then very slowly worked my way up, and now I'm a professor of engineering, and it's really a different world, and I'm glad I made the change.
You are a New York Times best-selling author of a science book, or many books, but one is called A Mind for Numbers, How to Excel at Math and Science, Even If You Flunked Algebra, published in 2014. It must have come out of your experience, because you're saying, I just switched from Russian to electrical engineering, no problem. But maybe that's something very particular to you. Maybe you're just super, super smart, and the rest of us, it's hopeless.
Oh, that's such a good point because it's actually so wrong. I'm really not super, super smart. In fact, one of my advantages, I think, is that it really takes me a long time to figure out even simple things. And so you might think, what's an advantage in that? But the advantage is when I figure something out, it's actually, the only way I can see it is in a very simple way. And then that's usually a way that you can explain something to others. Right. So it turns out I teach the world's largest massive open online course with Terry Sanowski, the Francis Crick professor at the Salk Institute. And this course is called Learning How to Learn. And I think if I had been one of those super smart people, I could never have done this course because it just breaks down and explains things in a very simple way. And that's what people really need in order to be able to learn. And trust me, it didn't come instantly for me to figure out how to explain things in a very simple way. I really have to struggle with my learning. There's all sorts of neurocognitive evidence that people who have, for example, poor working memories, they can't hold things very easily in mind, they have to struggle with their learning, they actually do see things in a breakthrough, simpler fashion that smarter people often just can't see. You co-teach a course or co-developed a course, Learning How to Learn, with Dr. Sechnowski, as you mentioned, at the Salk Institute, and it's the world's largest massive open online course with nearly, the last data I have is 1.3 million students. Can you describe the premise of the course? And I'm also wondering if the sheer enrollment size somehow plays into your research on learning. There's over a million students. Well, we're actually just crossing the 2 million
Oh, my goodness.
Student, Mark. I mean, people really like this course. And I think part of it is I was invited to speak at Harvard about this course. And I was just nonplussed. I thought, wow, here I am, this little professor from the Midwest, invited to speak at Harvard. What do I do? And I was very nervous. And it turns out that one single course made for less than $5,000, mostly in my basement, actually had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. So my presentation was packed. I was pretty surprised. But I think the thing is that often people put it in their heads that it's really, really hard to make these kinds of online courses. But the reality is that with the breakthroughs in technology, it's actually pretty straightforward. And really, if you want to do something like this and you're stuck and you need some help, just go ask a local high school kid, because they'll be able to help you. So it is so funny how professors will be like, oh, only the experts can do the editing, and only we've got to have this gigantic crew. And it's actually not necessary at all nowadays. And it really does inform my teaching about learning, because when you're hearing back, the only disadvantage to having a really popular course like that is, even though it runs itself, there's great mentors who help, kind of their teaching assistants who volunteer and kind of make sure that the course is running beautifully. It's easy for anybody to take this course, but the thing that I've learned from it are a lot of times academics get all lost in these narrow aspects of what they're learning. So they might think about things like deliberate practice, that is, like focusing on the hardest stuff, or interleaving, which means using different techniques, which are really important, but they're actually only a part of what you need to know to really learn effectively. And the biggest, in fact, the elephant in the room when it comes to learning is procrastination. And a lot of time, educators it's like they just gloss right over that. I think a lot of times because, well, they're really good educators, and what educators will do is they just focus on their narrow aspect of some narrow aspects of learning, forgetting these much larger aspects, and also not being aware of breakthrough work that's going on in other fields. For example, in fields like neuroscience, chunking it's a dramatically important research area that involves all forms of expertise, and yet you'll rarely find educators aware of the whole concept of chunking. And so, well, it's a terrible word, because it's so confusing. In fact, there's a paper on the confusion that the word chunking has created, because it does mean that you break things into smaller parts. But another completely different meaning is that you are creating a neural pattern, a sort of chunk in your mind, a pattern that you can, if you create this solid pattern, you can easily pull it to mind. And the best example is backing up a car. When you're first learning to back up a car, your working memory is going crazy, and you don't know whether to look in the front mirror, the side mirror, look behind you, look in front of you. You back up into a ditch, and it's no good. But once you've learned to back up the car, in other words, you've created that neural pattern, that neural chunk. All you have to do is think, oh, I want to back up the car, and boop, that chunk comes. You're instantly able to access it, and you can back up the car without even thinking, because you created this solid neural pattern. And that's really what happens in the development of any form of expertise, whether you're learning a language or you're learning math and science, you're learning to dance, you're learning a musical instrument, taekwondo, you name it, you're always developing these neural patterns that help you to easily call to mind and do difficult things.
You're touching on the training portion of training and performance of your brain, huh?
Absolutely.
Mm. Now, you touched upon the procrastination. Dr. Oakley, you have a new book out, I believe, called Mind Shift, and in it, there's a little bit about the Pomodoro technique. You described it as valuable in dealing with procrastination and keeping on track. So, why is it called Pomodoro, and what is it? And how does it help us with procrastination?
Well, I can share that the 2 million learners of Learning How to Learn, one of their top techniques that they love from the course is the Pomodoro technique. Okay. And this fantastic approach was developed by an Italian, Francesco Cirillo, in the 1980s. Pomodoro is, in fact, the Italian word for tomato. And he has this cute little tomato-shaped timer that you can use, but really any sort of timer can be used. You can even find all sorts of apps. For me, I just download a timer onto my computer desktop, and I use that for a Pomodoro. And all you need to do is turn off all distractions, first off. So no beeping from your phone, no little ringy-dingies, and nothing from no pop-ups from your computer, nothing to distract you as much as humanly possible. Although, of course, if you're a parent and you have a little one running around, that makes things a little tougher. But do the best you can. And then set that timer for 25 minutes, and then you focus as intently as you can for 25 minutes. And then the most important part of all is to reward yourself when you finish. Why is that important? Because it's a little like Pavlov's dogs. If you think about it, they would hear a bell, and they'd know that they're going to get a food reward later on. Your reward, of course, doesn't need to be food. They knew they were going to get a reward, and so they began salivating. They were actually really excited and happy during that waiting period because they knew there was going to be a reward. And so, in essence, those dogs had been trained to have this enjoyment period after they heard a bell. Well, when you set a timer and you start doing a Pomodoro, if you know that you're going to have a reward period at the end, listen to a favorite song, go dance around on the Internet, do whatever you'd like to do, it helps you to actually enjoy that period of focusing more. You actually get so you kind of enjoy it. I'll even find that, for example, I'm sitting there, I'm kind of, I'm supposed to be the model of efficiency, right? But of course I'm not. I'll catch myself kind of looking around on the Internet and having a little fun. And then when I notice that, and it kind of becomes apparent that, I probably better be actually getting some work done, I will go and I'll set the timer. As soon as I set that timer, I don't think about what I'm going to be working on. In other words, I don't think, I've got to get this report done, right? Because actually thinking about something you don't like or don't want to do activates the pain centers of the brain. So I just think I gotta do this. I gotta work on this for 25 minutes. I don't even think about what this is. I just start working on it. So I'm not activating those pain centers so much, and I can get into the flow much more easily through using the Pomodoro, just because I've become used to, that's my ding. I kind of start that out, and it's a period when I know I'm going to get a reward at the end of it. I may not go 25 minutes. I may, if I'm in the flow of things, I have to do 25 minutes, but I may let it keep going if I'm in the flow, just because, hey, I'm in the flow, it's okay, I'll keep working, but I make sure to reward myself when I'm done.
Why 25 minutes? Is there a reason why is there some scientific reason why it's 25 minutes, or is that just arbitrary?
My sense is that at the time that Cirillo came up with this approach, that we didn't have the neuroscience to know why. It was just a little less than half an hour, and so I think he used that as it's motivational to know it's not even a half an hour, but he can do 25 minutes. It may also have been motivated by some of his own intuitive sense of what we're now beginning to discover neuroscientifically. Remember that pain that's activated when you think about something you don't like? Well, that goes away after 20 minutes.
I see.
And more than that, it seems that 20 minutes is like this magic time period after which when you're working on it that long, your brain starts to kind of wrap more completely around whatever you're working on. You get into the flow. So there's starting to be some good neuroscientific evidence that 25-minute time frame is really a good one.
The professor, that your students can only take a lecture for, between 50 minutes and an hour and 30 or something, and then it's like, forget it. It's like they need a break.
It is funny that, well, there are cultural differences. For example, I can go to China and speak in Beijing, and man, I don't care if I'm talking for 2 hours, they are there, right? But a typical American audience or a set of students, I'd say about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes max, before they need something that is a little different. That's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because it just means that if you're standing up in front of the lecture hall and you're talking away for longer than 15 or 20 minutes without giving the students a chance to actively work on or respond to or talk to one another in regards to the material, you're sort of losing them, because Americans, at least, and many Westerners, they can only focus for so long before they need some kind of a break. And it doesn't have to be a long one, and it can be a valuable learning break. But it's important to kind of build in these, you might think of them as commercials, like a little break in whatever you're teaching, for them to actively turn to one another and work with the material. That's been shown to be really helpful in the learning process.
And there's something about the creative process, being able to jump out of a line of thought and jump out of the box.
I think that the best of all learning would combine approaches from the East and West. I think each one has some really good aspects and ignores others. And if you combined them together, you'd have the winning formula for learning. In fact, I think you're bringing up a very important point, and that point relates to learning styles. Learning styles is this huge industry, and it's often run on poor or non-existent research. There's a lot of money to be made in having learning styles tests, and having students take tests that say whether they're visual or they're auditory learners. And research is beginning to reveal that is totally misleading, that students who think that they're visual, for example, as opposed to auditory, they learn just as well in auditory fashion as those who think that they're auditory versus visual learners. And it can actually be detrimental to be teaching kids that, they should be trying to learn things using their best learning style, because what that does is it doesn't really strengthen their best learning style, but it does, it can weaken their worst learning style. So if you think you're, for example, an auditory learner, and you start really getting your information as much as possible through listening, what are all the tests going to be given to you as you're going through life? They're going to be in written form. They're not going to spoon feed you with auditory testing. And more than that, if you're a teacher who's telling students that it's much better to learn through a specific style and you should be taught according to that style, what you're doing is setting yourself up to be sued if you don't teach according to that style. Because if you say it's clearly better, then you're just creating more problems for yourself. That the learning styles approach, it can be so misleading because, for example, you can think you're a visual learner, but actually that combines with the auditory pathways. Everybody is an auditory and visual, unless you have a severe impairment. You take in through all of your senses, and the more you can use while you're learning, the better you are.
And I hope that teaching teachers to teach, I hope that in that content it's moving more towards a holistic or approach or a range of let's cover all the different modalities, and so that there can be the overlap and the coverage, not just focusing down one pipeline.
Exactly. I think that's a great way to approach teaching, is just try to think of as many different modalities as you can. And another thing that's very important is the use of metaphor in teaching. Metaphor, when you're trying to learn anything, what a metaphor does connect what you're trying to learn with what you already know. And so it forms this great bridge. And in fact, you use the same, it's called neural reuse theory. You use the same parts, the same patterns in your brain you've developed for the one area. Through metaphor, you can use those same patterns again, reuse them to learn something new much more rapidly.
Neural reuse, such as on the associative property that our brains, the human brains, use a lot.
Yes, I think so. And, of course, artificial intelligence. I like what Andrew Ng, he is the co-founder of Coursera. That's the online course provider that I do Learning How to Learn with Terry through. And he says worrying about artificial intelligence or the dangers of artificial intelligence is sort of like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. I thought that's just a great summary of there's so many intriguing new innovations, I think, particularly in education. I just remember my younger daughter, she's a spectacularly gifted writer. And it was about 7th grade, and she wrote this report, and it was really, really good. And it's not just a mom saying this. I mean, it was really creative, beautifully written. I didn't do a thing to it. I mean, it was just fantastic. And I'm a good writer. I know good writing. And I said, man, you are going to get an easy A on this. This is spectacular. And she went off, and she was so, just happy. And then she got the paper back, and it was a C-. And the teacher she just put a C- on it. No comments, no nothing. It was a brilliant paper. So, of course, I wanted to helicopter right in there and, have a talk with that teacher. And my daughter, she would have nothing of it. And I didn't want to override her desires. But for the next decade, she goes around thinking, I'm a terrible writer because, what does mom know? Her teacher is the one who really knows. And she really internalized, I'm a terrible writer, based on this teacher who really didn't care and didn't bother to do anything. And I think artificial intelligence, when you start getting artificial intelligence kind of looking over and providing some insight and guidance on writing, it'll be not only more fair for students, but I freak these colleges where they'll say, it's not our job to teach writing. We will teach rhetorical ideas, but it's really hard to teach about the grammatical structure of putting together good sentences and so forth. And if you turn this kind of really difficult work over to artificial intelligence to help provide some guidance. Trust me, you might think, oh, we're letting the machines teach them, but a machine would have been way better than my daughter's teacher. And we know it's a statistical truism to say that half of all teachers are below average. And sometimes average isn't that good. So I think artificial intelligence will be a boon for teachers. It'll help take some of the drudgery away from them, and it'll be a real boon for students.
Do you see this as the next thing that's coming, an unavoidable component that's coming into teaching, artificial intelligence?
Well, there's that old saying, moving a university is like moving a cemetery. You can't expect any help from the inhabitants. And I think it's a bit that way in many industries. But I think unavoidably in the long run, it's going to have a substantial impact in education. And meanwhile, educators will, to some extent, do everything they can to oppose these innovations. There's a wonderful book by Virginia Postrel called The Future and Its Enemies. And it kind of discusses this sort of status thinking. I think that technology and artificial intelligence is going to be a real boon for teachers. It's going to take away some of the real drudgery from them. And it will also help them up their game. For example, you can, in basketball in the 1950s, suddenly everybody started playing basketball better, right? I mean, all these kids who were from disadvantaged backgrounds suddenly were coming up with these great new moves and just really being great players. Why? It was because television came out, and that had an impact. All of a sudden, it didn't matter if you were from a poor family. You could really see how to play basketball like the world champions. And it's kind of like that in education. In the past, we couldn't go very easily into classrooms and actually see great teachers teaching. But now you can. You can see the best in the world out there. And you can learn from them and actually improve your face-to-face teaching as a consequence. And I think it's a movement that will raise all boats.
It will raise all boats. You know, what an untapped resource. And people are just beginning to become aware of it, seeing how they do it and using that for training and feedback. That's an interesting thought. Anything that stands out your time in Antarctica? I believe you're a radio operator, the South Pole station?
Yes, I was. Well, I'll tell you what stood out from that is that's where I met my husband. I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. Valuable for an educator to have experiences that are outside the educational norm, because it helps you to get a perspective on students and what students, you know, where they're coming from. I think all of these kinds of experiences have helped. Even working with the Soviets was a very insightful experience. I saw how wonderfully well-minded people could drive a society into a terrible, terrible situation where people were fearful of saying anything because they could be hauled off and disappeared by the KGB or the political commissar. It makes a difference in your own life when you see how people can kind of get – we have this idea that if everybody believes something, it's got to be true, or everybody in our social circles believes something, it's got to be – that's what it's got to be in reality. And that's so not true. And I think that was a valuable insight for me in having worked in the Soviet Union.
Any comments about our present situation?
Part of my research area involves pathologies of altruism. So I did
of altruism. Okay.
So I did an edited book for Oxford University Press with my co-editors called Pathological Altruism, and also did a paper for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on that concept. And I think that that's actually a vitally important topic for what's going on today, particularly in regards to education. People will often sort of assume that they know what's best for other people. And they'll take that assumption and they won't listen to other parties because they're so deeply convinced that what they're doing is correct. And then because that means that they find ways to block off hearing anyone who would have, broaden the perspective or provide some other ideas about that. And it can lead to real problems because, as the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The fellow who did a lot of the peace talks between Northern Ireland and in the UK, he said something I think that was very important. He just said, to have people really working constructively together, you really need to get them all in the room and speaking with one another. As soon as you say, nope, that group is evil, I'm not even going to talk to them, and you kind of put them away and vilify them, then no fruitful discussions can begin to take place between major parties who actually need to be working together to society's benefit.
Spoken with several folks, and that's a common theme that comes out, that there needs to be a lot of listening and just trying to get to the middle somewhere, some common ground. We covered a lot of ground there. I think we will close. Yeah, I wanted to thank you for your insights and conversation today, Barbara.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on the show. I've really, really enjoyed speaking with you.
I want to thank you all for listening out in the audience. Today my guest has been Dr. Barbara Oakley. I'm Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.